Today at the National Press Club, the 2019 Sydney Peace Prize recipients Tarana Burke and Tracey Spicer. The pair will discuss the Me2 movement, Women Changing the World. Tarana Burke and Tracey Spicer from the National Press Club in Canberra.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name is Sabra Lane. I am the club's president. It's my pleasure today to introduce Tarana Burke and Tracey Spicer, the joint recipients of this year's 2019 Sydney Peace Prize. They'll receive the prize tomorrow night. If you're following the conversation online, yes, please applaud. If you're following the conversation online, you'll find us on Twitter. Our Twitter user handle is @PressClubAUST. You can use the hashtag MPC and also hashtag Me2. To kick off today, I invite Tracey Spicer to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabra. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my deep respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge that the issues we're speaking about today are experienced at an exponentially higher rate by marginalised communities, particularly women of colour and our First Nations women and children. This speech is a tribute to the many survivors of sexual harassment and abuse, those who have spoken out and those yet to find their voice. May they all find the justice they well and truly deserve. They are the recipients of this great gift that is the Sydney Peace Prize. I also pay tribute to Tarana Burke. Tarana, I know it doesn't really need to be said, but she's a true trailblazer who's spent her life working in the area of sexual violence. This work is tough, underpaid and often thankless. It's what is traditionally and historically known as women's work, like so much of it throughout history. So today we say, from the bottom of our hearts and the very depths of our souls, Tarana, thank you. Now, someone who you may not have heard about is Mariam. Her name has been changed to protect her identity. I met Mariam earlier this year in one of Australia's fruit bowls, Shepparton, alongside a union representative. Like many of the migrant workers in the area, Mariam and her husband had come here from one of our near neighbours in Southeast Asia. Once in Australia, many of these workers are paid well below minimum wage, horrifically exploited and threatened with deportation if they speak out. The union rep told of one woman being raped in broad daylight by a farm worker in a field. Mariam thought she'd be safer working in a packing shed. Her boss thought otherwise. He asked her to suck his penis, and later he repeatedly groped her. When she complained about her treatment, both Mariam and her husband were sacked. Forget about all the celebrities who've been named or not named because of our restrictive defamation laws. These are the stories the media needs to tell. 7 out of 10 women in rural and regional Australia experience sexual harassment as part of their everyday work. Now, just imagine for a second what that must be like. Living in a remote location, you're isolated already. Something like this happens to you, you know you have to face it every day at work, and there is nothing you can do about it. There's not the support services that we have in the city. For more than 18 months, a documentary team has been working on a 3-part series called Silent No More. You'll see it later this month on the ABC. Our aim is to broaden the voices around the Me2 movement in Australia, to hear from more marginalised communities and low-paid industries where harassment and abuse is prevalent and the power gap between perpetrator and survivor is even wider. Indigenous women, culturally diverse women, migrants and refugees, and women with disabilities, where sexism intersects with racism, ableism and bigotry. This is where the conversation really must go. These workers have had little opportunity or support, and it's been an incredible privilege for the documentary team to help in some small way to be able to amplify their important voices. To meet so many extraordinary people questioning the way we approach being human, sharing the workplace and sharing the world. And to know that the catharsis they feel and the courage they've shown will change both the workplace and the world for the next generation, for all of our kids. Still, sadly, sharing these stories is a far from perfect process. There is great risk and too often great heartache. I need to address recent media coverage accusing the ABC, the production company and me of being lax in maintaining people's privacy. The ABC has sent a statement out regarding an early version of the documentary series, a documentary in which I was one of many participants. I was not a producer. This version was posted under embargo on a subscriber-only portal to a select group of media who committed not to share this with third parties. Now, I agreed to take part in this program on the understanding that those who told their stories agreed to do it, formally agreed. I agreed to take part on the understanding that any other item of identifying information in any of the stories was blurred, redacted, de-identified. The fact that this wasn't done in several cases in this early version of the portal is deeply, deeply distressing to those who trusted me and to me personally. I am truly sorry, and frankly, I am gutted and devastated by what has happened. Once the ABC was made aware of this grave error, it removed the content immediately. Just to be clear, all names and identifying material had already been blurred from the final version of the series airing on November 25. On the matter of disclosures, after sending out a tweet in October 2017 asking for stories about two men in the Australian media, I received more than 2,000 messages. I did not keep personally soliciting disclosures, despite what some have suggested. However, I did feel an enormous duty of care to every person who contacted me. I had lengthy correspondence and conversations with the vast majority of them. I am so very sorry that some survivors didn't hear back from me. I know that must have added to their already deep distress. Early last year, my Fairfax email address was shut down and no messages were forwarded to me. This tsunami of disclosures is a key reason why I connected with more than 24 people to set up the not-for-profit Now Australia. It's why, after much discussion, including conversations with many in the women's sector, we plan to establish a triage service, because clearly the systems that are in place to support survivors are inadequate under the weight of such an historic outpouring. I acknowledge that as one freelance journalist, as a volunteer, trying to answer thousands of messages, I was wholly inadequate. Now, we need to talk about what happens next for survivors within workplaces and on the streets, because reporting is not enough. Storytelling is not enough. Policies and procedures on paper but not put into practice are definitely not enough. We need services that are properly resourced and staffed and promoted to the community to ensure victims of abuse know where they can safely turn in times of need. We need systems and structures in place that protect survivors and prevent further abuse. And we need to change the conversation from the lounge room to the boardroom. Make no mistake, the cultural change has begun, but we must forge forward to avoid being stuck in the backlash. At this time of global hate and horror and convicted social media shout rage, we need to bring people together into the middle, to have civilised conversations instead of tearing each other apart, and to work together for lasting change. This is what the Sydney Peace Prize is all about. The Australian portion of the prize is going to a wonderful organisation called JIRA, run by the brilliant Antoinette Braybrook. Jira runs culturally appropriate support services for Indigenous women, including the Young Love program, which offers consent training to teenage girls. You can hear Antoinette at Sydney Town Hall tomorrow night. She'll be speaking in my place. I'm also looking forward to revealing a special location where the Australian Peace Prize will be on display, to enable everyone who feels a connection with the Me2 movement to visit. A place to reflect on how far we've come and how far we have to go. As the great Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Thanks to people like the great Tarana Burke and the entire Me2 movement, we can now see that justice on the horizon. Thank you.
Tarana Burke, welcome to the Press Club. Congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you, Tracey. Thank you for that speech. Thank you for having me here. I am deeply honored to be here in Australia to accept the 2019 Sydney Peace Prize on behalf of the global Me2 movement. It's always humbling to be acknowledged for your hard work, and this is hard work. And it's even more humbling to be acknowledged on a global stage. The last 2 years have been both amazing and challenging. Amazing in that I have watched this idea that originated as a grassroots movement become a global phenomenon. In the first year following the viral moment, the hashtag was used more than 19 million times, making it one of the most prolific in the history of Twitter. The MeToo hashtag has been used in more than 180 countries worldwide, ranging in size, demographic, and stage of development. Countries as strikingly different as India and Sweden have been impacted by the uprising of citizens who have found collective courage in the ability to give voice to the pervasiveness of sexual violence in our society. And although it's impossible to know when and where a viral moment will happen, I'm clear that the far reach of this movement is no accident. We are in a unique historical moment. While the fight to end sexual violence has roots planted decades before now, the movement has never had such a sustained worldwide response. Opportunities such as this don't come often. So as citizens who want to live in a more safe and just world, as I assume all of you do, right? So as citizens who want to live in a more safe and just world, it is important that we are good stewards of this opportunity. As such, I would be remiss if I didn't say in this room full of journalists that we have to be careful not to squander the opportunity right in front of us. And that opportunity is to impact the safety of ourselves, our loved ones, and our future generations. We all have a role. And as journalists, you may think that you don't, but let me tell you what your role can be. Do your job well. And I don't mean that as a slight in any way. This opportunity was created in large part because of stellar journalism. You all are the ones who shape how we think and how we respond to the challenges of the moment. And I'm not suggesting that you take a side, because there should be no other side in the issue of freedom from sexual violence and bodily autonomy. You don't have to be biased. The truth is compelling enough. I submit that there is just more to the story that's being told. The struggle to ensure that a more broad, inclusive story is told has been a challenge in the United States, and we have seen the same issues around the world, including Australia. When I say there is more to the story, I'm talking about the more than 60,000 survivors of institutional child sexual abuse here in Australia, and the 1 in 6 women and 1 in 9 men who will experience sexual violence before 15 years old, and the Aboriginal community, who are almost 3.5 times more likely to experience sexual violence than all other Australians. I know your hands are tied by these monstrous defamation laws, but you don't have to defame anyone to paint a clear picture of what the landscape of sexual violence looks like in this country, or to talk about the breadth of the Me Too movement. In fact, reporting that has such a narrow focus on individual instances of calling out bad actors is one of the biggest challenges we face as a global movement, because it perpetuates two of the myths that we are working to dismantle. One is that sexual violence is a private, apolitical act between individuals with private impact for the individuals harmed or the ones who caused harm. And the second is that sexual violence is not a structural social justice issue, but ultimately an interpersonal one, or failure perpetrated by bad actors, i.e. casting out the person who sexually violate others alone will solve the problem, over organizing to dismantle structures of power and organizing to eradicate the roots of sexual violence in our families, workplaces, and communities. This is not a movement about simply calling out individual bad actors, but about the global health crisis of sexual violence. In the first 24 hours, we've heard this before, of the first tweet that went out, there were 12 million uses of the hashtag on Facebook alone. In the first year, when Alyssa Milano made that tweet, she had 850 responses in the first 12 hours. And I've told you already that there were 19 million tweets by October of 2018. And even with millions of survivors of all stripes boldly and bravely coming forward to say that their lives have been affected by this pandemic, we still turn on the nightly news and hear questions being posed about paying compliments to coworkers and examinations of the lives of the accused. Still, the focus for a lot of media outlets is on who will be next, as opposed to who is coming forward and who is not, and why. Just imagine for a moment if the viral hashtag MeToo was instead an infectious disease outbreak. Imagine if we woke up tomorrow to 12 million instances of a disease that we've never heard of, and it spread like wildfire across the world. There would only be three questions we'd ask, or the first three questions we'd ask is, how did we get here? How could this disease be so widespread to the tune of 1/5 of our population being affected by it? We'd ask, how do we stop it? Now that these numbers of cases have been revealed to us, what do we need to do to make sure it doesn't grow any further? And how do we make sure it never comes back again? What systems need to be dismantled and restructured to make sure we never find ourselves in these positions again? We've not asked those questions yet. These are not the questions being asked in the moment. Instead, we're asking things like, can men and women even work together anymore? And is there life after Me Too for the accused? But you aren't the only ones moving in the wrong direction. I'm not here to just beat up on journalists. Even the government, in the face of increasing numbers of survivors coming forward and organizations who support them being inundated and desperately in need of resources, have defunded those on the front line of this work. It's unconscionable. We talk about the numbers all the time. I have quoted the 12 million people in 24 hours and the 19 million people in a year over and over again. We talk about the proliferation of the hashtag, but we forget that every hashtag is a human being. Every hashtag is a person who sat down in front of their computer contemplating, should I say it? What will happen? What will people say? What if nobody likes my comment? Every bit of the Me Too movement was built on the backs of survivors, by the labor of people who have already suffered some of the worst things you could suffer in life. And yet we forget about them most times when we open our mouths. I hope that my presence in this country and on the global stage helps people to understand what the Me Too movement is actually about. If you can't remember the numbers and the statistics and the anecdotes that I've thrown at you, please remember this. The Me2 movement is about two things: healing and action. Healing and action. Almost 2 years ago, millions of people around the world raised their hands to say that their lives have been affected by this disease. And most of their hands are still raised, waiting for a response. Our work is about ensuring that the people who have been affected by sexual violence have the resources necessary to craft their own healing journey. And it's about a call to action to make sure that everybody knows that you have a role to play. We all have a role to play in this fight to end sexual violence. Healing and action, period. That's the story that's dying to be told. Thank you.
Tarana, thank you very much for your speech. A question for both of you. Social media has helped to put a spotlight on sexual assault, sexual harassment, but it's also become a very, very toxic environment, as you pointed out, Tracey. It's become the platform to fight culture wars, political wars, gender wars. Has the pendulum swung too far? Is it now so toxic that it's really not a good place for any of us to be?
Well, hello? Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, I talk about this all the time because I was not a heavy social media user prior to Me2 going viral. I mean, I did the, requisite Facebook checking in and going on Twitter when I had something to talk about. But one of the things that affected me most when Me2 first went viral was watching people cut and bleed on the internet and tell their stories and talk about these really personal things in a place that is traditionally not really safe. But I feel both ways. I feel that we wouldn't be here if not for the internet and if not for social media. And what the hashtag did and the viralness of Me2 did is create community for survivors that most people didn't know existed. So many of us suffer in silence or in small silos, and so you think that what you're dealing with is the worst thing in the world, and you think that you're the only one, or that the way it's affecting you, it hasn't affected other people. And what social media gave us was a community, was a place to say, oh, I'm not alone. There are so many millions of us, unfortunately, but we are here. So I think there's definitely some good in it. I mean, the trolls and the vitriol and the nastiness is hard, and it's, I have nothing good to say about that, obviously, but I think we have to balance it out. We definitely need social media as a way to connect. There's no way in the world we could connect across the globe without without a tool like social media. I just think that we have to make sure that we don't mistake global connection with people as a movement, right? Movements, I think social media is a tool to enhance the movement, but it's not a movement alone. In order for movements to be successful and to be successful, they have to be boots on the ground. People have to connect with one another in person. You have to be old school, door to door, grassroots. That's how you grow movements. But I definitely believe it's a useful tool.
Tracey?
Yeah, I'd agree. When we saw the fragmentation of the mass media about 15 years ago and the rise of what was then called new media and social media around the world, it did amplify the voices of women and marginalised communities like never before and connected all of those grassroots movements globally. However, it now has become incredibly toxic, yet this is nothing new. I want to talk about it a bit from an historical perspective because women have been silenced from the time of Homer's Odyssey when Penelope was told to go up, Penelope, and work on your loom. Speech is the business of men. So this is merely the modern version of trying to silence women and marginalised communities. What governments and what social media organisations need to do is to make it a safe place for people who are not safe online at the moment. It's absolutely their responsibility, and we need to keep calling it out until they do something.
Shalom, Dora.
Shalila Medora from Triple J and Women in Media. Thank you very much both for your speeches. My question for you is actually directed to both of you. Tarana, in your speech you talked about how the point of Me Too is action and healing. And in the early days of Me Too we saw a lot of optimism about action and about consequences for people that perpetrated violence and abuse. But since then we've seen a lot of perpetrators who are at the centre of this re-emerge, seemingly unscathed. We've seen defamation laws stymie efforts here in this country. And I guess I wanted to ask you if you're disappointed about the lack of action or perceived lack of action and consequences.
So the work that we're doing and what Me Too is built on is a different kind of action. And so when I'm talking about action, it's not the calling out of perpetrators or even the punishment of perpetrators. There's so much more action that has to take place. And honestly, even to the end of healing, we as survivors cannot tie our healing to the outcome of what happens to perpetrators. We can't tie our healing to the outcome of a defamation case no more than we can a criminal case, right? Our healing has to be tied to what we do in community with each other to become whole again. And so no, I expect the systems to do what the systems have always done. And I expect that the people, those of us who know that the systems are corrupt or unjust, to do what we've always done, which is stand up, vocalize it, and fight back. And so I'm not disappointed. I'm disappointed in the way it's being portrayed, right? I'm disappointed that people are only thinking of action in this really finite way, and in Me Too, the Me Too movement is being looked at as wins and losses based on these variables, and not looking at taking a step back and looking at the larger picture. It's a win for me that we have so many people who are willing to stand up and put their bodies on the line for this movement. It's a win for me that we have people who are investigative journalists who are still pressing and holding the line and telling bigger and broader stories, right? It's a win for me that we can create our own media so that marginalized voices can come to the forefront in ways that we haven't before. I can't tie our wins, if you will, to laws like what you have here in Australia, because we never win. And around defamation, I mean. And I can't, I just try to look at it in a different way. That's not to say that those laws aren't ridiculous and that we shouldn't fight back against them, right? I don't want to make it seem like I'm Susie Sunshine optimistic over here and not thinking about these things, but that's how I have to frame it in order to move the work forward. I want people to think about action in a much broader sense. Action is also the individual things that we do to work to end sexual violence. That's way more important, or as important, as some of this other action.
I view a lot of this through a workplace lens, because most of the disclosures that came to me were from the workplace, not outside of the workplace. So I just want to preface my answer by saying that I have actually seen a lot of action being taken in certain sectors of the workplace in Australia. For example, at the very I suppose low-paid industries like hospitality. The union has done some incredible stuff there with a campaign called Respect is the Rule. Because we know in hospitality, 9 out of 10 people, usually young women, have been sexually harassed or assaulted. So that was really needed, and that was led by the young women on the ground. That was a real grassroots workplace movement. I've also seen action being taken at the top end of town, because the fear and shame that's been historically felt by survivors is now being felt by board directors and executives, and they know it's going to affect their bottom line, so they are instituting changes. Where I'm not seeing an impact is in the middle. So things like small business, family business franchises, where they've got really restrictive contracts that protect the power of those who run the businesses and really throw the employees under the bus when anything happens. And that's where it's got to move to now, middle Australia.
Lani Scar.
Hello, Lani Scar from the West Australian and Women in Media. There have been accusations that the Me2 movement in Australia has not gained as much traction as elsewhere. How do both of you respond to that? And secondly, you called out governments for defunding those on the front line. What are some tangible things that governments can do in addition to refunding some of those people who are doing great work on the front line? I'll
let you answer the first one.
No worries, thank you. I I think it's fair to say that the Me2 movement has taken a slightly different path in every country that's been touched by it. In Australia, certainly we've been stymied by our defamation laws, by what I will maintain is a lack of interest from a lot of media outlets, because they know that either some of their executives or some of their executive mates will be named. So we're talking about a power imbalance here. It's also been stymied in other ways. We have a Conservative government in place. So they're the three things I'd say that are having a great impact here. What we can do to move past that is to really support the Human Rights Commission when it comes out with the results of its national inquiry early next year. Australia has, for all of its faults, a world-first national inquiry. Now, whether the government takes up those recommendations, I have no power over, but I would urge the government to take up these recommendations to protect everyone in the workplace, regardless of gender, and the next generation. I am optimistic about the future, but yes, it has been stymied over the last 2 years for a variety of reasons.
Ginger Gorman. Sorry.
I would say about Australia and even other countries, one of the things that we worked hard on this year is creating a framework for the Me2 movement. Because I think I think of it as like writ large and writ little, right? There's hashtag Me2 that went viral, and a lot of people, and it spread like wildfire, and you can't control that. And then there's the Me2 movement that I started that grew, and the work that we're continuing to do post this viral moment. The reason why we created the framework is so that we can have an offering to people to say, this is what the Me2 movement is, and this is how, if you want to claim this work and say that you're doing the work of the movement, it should work within this framework. And in that framework, we talk about centering marginalized groups and making sure people who are often pushed to the margins are centered in the work first. And I think where a lot of countries have lost their footing is around that. And the reason why it hasn't taken off, if you will, is because if there is not an acknowledgement of the work the groundwork that was laid in the country, and I'm not just talking about Australia, I'm talking in lots of other places. What happened is that people mimicked what they saw in the U.S. in Hollywood, and so it became about whatever the equivalent to that is. Like in India, it was all about Bollywood and journalists and that kind of thing. And when I had a conversation with folks from the Me2 India movement saying, what are you doing about the Dalit women who have this incredible instances of sexual violence, and they had not spoke to each other. So what the framework does is allows us to come in and say, this is a way to operate together so that we can unify our work across the globe and be working on the same thing. And I think that helps to expand what that looks like in every country. And we'll have the opportunity, hopefully to do that here in Australia as well. What was the second part of your question? Oh, and governments, it's tricky. I always say you can't legislate healing, but the government does play a role in how we move this work forward. And so I know you have a conservative, obviously we do too, right? A lot of things can't happen, and I'm not familiar enough with the inner workings of the Australian government, but I know there's some similarities here. But for us, for instance, I know that I can't get a lot of federal laws passed in the United States right now. Until we get the Dorito-in-Chief out of office, it is up to us to do this. I'm sorry, did I say that out loud? Slip of the tongue. It's up to us on the grassroots and on the state level to do what we can to help pass legislation and policies that will help survivors and bring more resources into the community. I think that's what governments can do. I think we have to look locally and statewide to do what we can in those areas. And I think we have to have movement to push the government in the direction that we want them to go. Yes, you need to refund, give money back to these organizations that are on the ground doing that work. And those of us who have the power to be a part of these movements need to hold the line in what we want from the government about the policies and practices. And we should hold our government accountable for being a moral authority around this. Right? It's again, the issue we have in the United States. When you have a self-professed sexual predator running your country, it's hard to say this is what we should be like to young people, right? And so that means we have to create what that leadership looks like.
Just a follow-up question for both of you. Tarana, is there a country around the world that's doing it well? And if so, what are they doing? And Tracey, you said you didn't think the media organisations were pressing hard enough for defamation law reform because it would unveil some offenders amongst their own. They've been pushing pretty hard for defamation law reform because they think it's been stymied. For example, they're reporting on foreign influence. Do you acknowledge that?
Oh, absolutely, but we need to reform the whole system for people to be protected when they speak out, because sexual harassment is not about sex, it's about power. And when there are these great disparities of power, and particularly when that's protected by the current legal system, the current political system, and I would even broaden out the answer further to say until we have more women and minorities in roles of power in the judiciary, in the government and in the police force, then not much will change. So we're talking about a whole system change here.
Yeah, I'm sitting here racking my brain. I don't know that there's a country that I would say is doing it right. I think Sweden has some really interesting things happening in their country. We have some interesting things happening in the United States. I just think that there are pockets. There are pockets of this movement across the globe that are trying, and I also think that it's important that we acknowledge that. Nobody has the answer. There's no silver bullet here, but so many people are scared to try and fail. They're scared to grapple with this publicly and say, you know what? Now that Me Too has become this thing that we have to pay attention to, I realize we've mucked this up for a long time, right? So let's get some survivors here to talk to us about what they need. Let's get some people who've been on the ground. Like, people aren't doing that enough. They think that they can go into a boardroom and close the door and figure this out in the C-suite, or they can get a bunch of politicians and hold testimonies and have us come and pour our hearts out and tell our gory details of our story just for you to be like, that's interesting, we'll see what we can do. So that model that we've seen in many countries just doesn't work. And even, I just want to say this little thing about the defamation laws here too. I think the laws are really, really, really monstrous, as I said. But I also think that we can't get caught up in that being the thing that is holding the movement back here. It is one of the things, but there are so many people who could never even get to the point of defamation laws, right? Defamation affecting them. There's so many people who will never get to talk publicly about the person who did whatever to them, who caused them harm. And we have to think about the survivors who don't have that privilege even. It's a privilege to be able to speak out loud about some of these things. And so I think it's important. That's why I said in my speech that there are lots of ways to talk about this work, to think about this work that don't defame anybody, because this is a systemic problem. And if we talk about the systems that are in place, as you talked about, we need to be talking about power and privilege. And more important than that, the unchecked accumulation of power. That's what got us here. And so if we don't talk about how we dismantle those things, we don't have to name a name or call out a person. People know, first of all, right? People know who's in power and they know who's abusing power. But we need to constantly talk about that abuse of power and what the systems are in place. You can name one singular person. I'm not going to do it because Australia's not going to take my money. But I can name one singular person right now. And I promise you, I'll talk about the U.S., right? I say this all the time. We talk about Harvey Weinstein and Matt Lauer and blah, blah, blah. And it's fine. If you caused harm, you should be accountable for that harm. And if you've abused your power, you should cede that power, right? But even if you get rid of those people, there is another Matt Lauer right now being trained up somewhere. There's another Harvey Weinstein right now moving up the ranks of power in some corporation. So what do we do to upend the systems that allow them to become who they are? Those are the things that we have to focus on in order for us to really move the needle around ending sexual violence.
Ginger Gorman.
Ginger Gorman, freelance journalist and member of Women in Media. Thank you both for your talks. This is really for you, Tarana, but also, Tracey, I would like a response from you as well. I am a Me Too victim, as are many people in this room that I know, and I accept what you're saying, Tarana, about me having a platform to speak and that others can't. But I'm really worried at the moment in Australia about feminists attacking each other. And, you know, I was speaking to one survivor yesterday and I was saying, I'm tired of this finger pointing. What I care about is the man that attacked me and the man that attacked you is still in his job and has not been accountable. So I wonder how we stop attacking each other and keep our eyes on the ball and get the action that you're talking about, as opposed to imploding internally.
I don't know that I don't have a good answer for that. I'm gonna tell you that up front, right? I think that people come at this from different directions. There are people, you know, in the United States, I have criticism from people who say I shouldn't say we're working to end sexual violence. And I have criticism from other people who say, you know, I was just telling this story in the car about the backlog of rape kits, and they said, well, that's just gonna put more people in jail. People have different entry points to this work, right? Even as survivors. There's some survivors who want to stay focused on just calling out names and calling out people. I don't work that way. That's not the work that I'm doing. That's not the work that I am promoting. Although I support what you need to feel whole and to heal. And what I can do is tell you that I don't think that's the way to go about it, but I support whatever you need, whatever it is that you feel like you need in this moment. I think that people are going to fight, naturally, when they disagree. But I think that we all have the ability as adults and as passionate people about this cause to have conversation and to find some middle ground. The reason why you can have, you know, people across races and religion and all kind of demographics working on this one issue is because the issue itself doesn't discriminate. There's nobody, no demographic in the world that's not affected by sexual violence. And so yes, we'll come at it from different ways, but ultimately we want the same thing. So I don't know how to make the people stop fighting, you know, the feminists stop fighting amongst each other, but I bet it's not, I mean, I'm sure it's frustrating, but I'm hoping it's not to the detriment of the work at the end of the day, just because we want different things in this moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just worried that it's detracting, like the energy is being sucked away instead of actually keeping the momentum of the movement.
I would say that you can't help what other people do, so you personally keep focused on what you have to do and don't let other people get you distracted. Stay focused on what the end goal is, and if other people are biting at your heels and saying whatever, you just have to ignore that. If they're detrimental to what you're trying to do, then you need to know that you can't rock with those people. You got to keep focused. You can only help what you can do, right?
It's a really complex area with so many shades of grey. We have discussions, civilised debates in our lounge room with my son and daughter and my husband over this. I have disagreements as well as agreements with my friends and my colleagues. And all I would ask is that the disagreements be civilised and be constructive. Otherwise, it is sucking energy out of what we should be doing. I'd also like to put a call to action to all the journalists in the room and those watching and listening, that instead of pouring this energy and these what used to be called column inches into something that seems like interesting conflict or clickbait, to actually do stories on survivors while supporting them through the process. With the documentary, there's several areas that I would love someone to dig a bit deeper on. For example, the mining industry. We have a woman who was one of the first females working in the mining industry in this country. I'd like people to look at that larger structural stuff within certain industries and how we need to change that. I'd also like people to ask the government, why are they cutting funding to women's legal and community services and not supporting the important programs that are changing the conversation in the lounge room? I'd like people to ask why we don't have consent programs in every single school across the country. There are really important stories to be told, and sadly I see a lot of them relegated to what used to be considered the women's pages. These are stories that should be on the front pages of our newspapers.
Tim Shaw.
Thank you, Sabra. Tracey and Tarana, thank you so much for your address today. Tim Shaw, a member of the board of the National Press Club. Tarana, you said healing and action, and Tracey, you spoke of policy and procedure. Just following on from Lani's question about what government needs to do in terms of that invitation, that sense of welcome, that sense of trust, that policymakers need to make clear to those that come before them. Today, if someone is a victim of sexual assault, male or female, are we satisfied in this country, Tracey, that those mechanisms are in place for that reportage to be done with tenderness, with the care that it deserves? And Tarana, in the United States, those grassroots women from the grassroots that said enough, are you satisfied that in states of the United States that the authorities are taking heed? So The US policy, the Australian policy.
I just want to be clear. Are you saying, do I think that law enforcement officials or politicians in the U.S. are treating survivors well? Is that, I don't want to be clear about that.
Are they treating them better?
I don't have enough information to answer that well. My guess is no. There's still this very old sort of model at dealing with sexual violence, and for me, feigning compassion for survivors by having them tell their stories. And so you have these testimonies that are set up for people to come forward and tell their stories, and you have these forums that are set up for survivors to come forward and tell us what happened to you, tell their stories. I don't think that's being treated well. I think that we have enough empirical data, we have enough anecdotal data to let us know that this is an incredibly pervasive problem that touches everybody's life, every demographic, so that we don't need to, like I said, continue to cut and bleed in order to get a modicum of empathy. I think that in a very pragmatic way, our law enforcement officials and even politicians and anybody who engages with survivors of sexual violence outside of practitioners need more training in how to do that with more empathy and compassion. There's still this idea that you have to, there's still these underlying questions that you hear. There's still this doubt that people approach us with. And so I haven't seen that shift in ways that make me feel like we've seen a significant change. But I do think that, one of the things I try to do is push people around that and push people to break out of this model that we've gotten really used to, and push politicians even to stop asking people about what happened to them. Stop telling survivors they have to come and dredge up the most miserable, terrible thing that happened to them in order for you to feel like you need to change a policy or practice that you know is not just. So yeah, I'd love to see some more change around that. And the U.S., we need some help around there, I think. Yeah.
Such important points there in two different areas, and I'll put a little bit of an Australian lens over it from some of the people who've come forward to me. Some have had good experiences with the police officers who've been trained specifically to hear stories about sexual assault. Others have had the most horrific experiences with being slut-shamed, not only in the police station but then in court. I mean, absolutely devastating. Some describe it as being raped all over again. So we need to change the culture within our law enforcement. That is happening, but it's happening very slowly. With regards to the women's legal and community sector, there are extraordinary people who've worked in it for decades. And as I said, it's an often thankless, underpaid job where there's a lot of vicarious trauma. It's very difficult work. It needs to be better resourced, and it's also quite fragmented. So when people are in the moment, I mean, look, I'm a survivor. I was sexually assaulted at the age of 14. And when you're in that kind of moment, you really don't know where to turn, even though there are a lot of services out there. And if you turn to one and you call them and your call is not answered, that is absolutely devastating. So we need to resource them well enough that everyone, when they're in that situation, God forbid, that there is someone they can call and they know who to call, whether it is 1800-RESPECT or one of the many centres around Australia. And that's what the government needs to do.
Claudia Long.
Claudia Long, ABC. Thank you both for your speeches today. Tracey, your call on social media for disclosures around sexual misconduct, it's fair to say, was a pretty big moment for the Australian arm of the Me2 movement. You noted earlier that despite having the best of intentions, in the end the response was wholly inadequate. How concerned are you that the mismanagement of the mismanagement around that situation, it could be said, I guess, and the subsequent press around it have potentially knocked some of the steam out of the local Me2 movement?
I am absolutely devastated about what happened with the ABC and the production company and the early version of the documentary that was put on this subscriber-only portal that was viewed by certain media outlets. I am absolutely horrified that the proper policies and procedures that were in place were not good enough to properly protect survivors. And I say to every single survivor, I'm so deeply sorry from the bottom of my heart that that happened. I was wholly inadequate as a freelance journalist. When I sent out that tweet, I thought I'd receive 12 to 15 responses, because having been a journalist for 30 years, it's actually really difficult to tell these stories, really difficult for people to feel supported through the process of sharing these horrific experiences. So for this to happen is absolutely horrific, to be honest with you. The ABC has assured me that that was taken offline immediately, and the final version of the documentary that goes to air on November 25 had everything redacted and blurred, and furthermore everyone involved in it and identified has signed agreements saying that they agreed to be formally part of the process. So I have confidence that ongoing the policies and procedures will be supportive. However, any more detail you'll need to hear it from the ABC, because the last version of the documentary I saw was a couple of months ago as a participant before it went through these processes.
Can I just pick you up on that point? Are you referring to that, or you were referring to the initial call out?
Sorry, I would just like to draw you on, I guess, the answer. Specifically, though, the issue with disclosures not being answered, obviously getting thousands more than you expected. How much steam do you think those emails going unanswered has taken out of the movement?
Oh yes, thank you for clarifying your question. When I received more than 2,000 after putting out that initial call, I tried desperately to get back to everyone within 48 hours, and some days I was speaking to 15 to 20 people who'd been sexually harassed or assaulted. I very quickly developed vicarious trauma and a major depressive disorder because I wasn't qualified to be hearing these stories as a freelance journalist. I then did the 2 investigative pieces with Fairfax and the ABC, and not long after that, Fairfax unfortunately closed down my email address and refused to forward any messages to me. So messages that went missing were either sent to the Fairfax email address or sent to a union email address that was set up and then weren't sent to me either. So there are a lot of flaws in this very patched together system because of a tsunami of disclosures that I most certainly didn't expect. And that's why I feel devastated for anybody who didn't hear back, because it certainly was by no means an ideal system.
Gina Rushton.
Hi, I'm Gina Rushton. Oh, sorry, my chair just fell over. BuzzFeed News.
Gina, where are you from?
BuzzFeed News. Tracey, in your opening remarks, you acknowledged our story published today, which showed that you breached the privacy of 2 women by allowing their names and stories to be filmed on your computer screen for Silent No More. You've obviously just mentioned that you're absolutely flooded with disclosures and the personal toll it's taken. Should the other 2,500 and something survivors who disclosed to you be worried about their privacy?
No, I am confident that the privacy procedures that I have taken initially and then the ABC and the production company took subsequent to that have protected survivors' privacy. And the last thing that I want from this conversation is for people to feel worried or distressed or for it to be devastating for them all over again, because I can only imagine what it's like for people to find out something like this. It is absolutely shocking.
Alice Workman.
Hi, Alice Workman from The Australian. Thank you both so much for your time today. Just following up on Gina's question, you've noted that you were told that privacy details would be redacted, but specifically, Tracey, why did you allow cameras to film such sensitive information without consent? Do you not think that this is a breach of privacy and maybe potentially unethical as a journalist?
There was consent for the people who were involved in the conversations around the documentary process. Some of the names that appeared were not supposed to be in the background at all. And that's something you'll have to bring up with the production company and the ABC, because I personally was given assurances that these would not be in shot.
Sorry, just to follow up, but you as a journalist allowed a camera crew to film yourself scrolling through private messages that people sent disclosing you know, very serious allegations. Do you not feel that that is a breach of privacy?
There were procedures that the production company undertook that I, as a participant in the documentary, can't go into the details of because of every participant signed a confidentiality agreement, but I'm not saying that to not answer your question. It's simply the facts surrounding it. This production company had done many documentaries in the past around sensitive areas, and I trusted them with people's privacy and with the confidentiality of the documentary. Now, whether that was naive of me, possibly yes. They told me about the policies and procedures that would be in place, and I trusted that that would be in place.
Astrid Watts.
Hi Tracey, hi Tarana, thank you for your awesome speeches. During Julie Gillard's time as the first female Australian Prime Minister, she was subject to disgusting sexist abuse from significant, powerful elements in the mainstream media, both female and male. So if more women in positions of power is a solution to the systemic problem of sexual abuse, how do we prevent them from being torn down by those who are threatened?
I'm so glad you said that. That's not a solution that I offer often, right? I don't think, and I'm not trying to contradict, I understand the impetus to want to have, obviously we want to have more representation, we want to have more women, we want to have more people of color in positions of leadership. However, I'll tell you a quick story. I was on a yacht in the south of France with some CEOs of some large, Fortune 500 companies, randomly like, why am I here? But for a luncheon, and the CEO of this global corporation said to me, very impressed with himself, Tarana, I get it, and I am just like shoving women up into leadership. We're getting minorities and we're getting women through the door, and and I said, why? I said, what does your company believe in? What do you stand for, right? What are your values? And are you ensuring that every person that comes through the door agrees with those values? Because if you just line the walls of whatever with women or people of color, and they don't share the kind of values that say keep the door open for people behind you, you're not doing us any favors. I don't need women just for the sake of having women in leadership. Right? If they have been, we all have been socialized under the same patriarchy. We all have sexism that we have to deal with. We all have misogyny that we have to exercise from our day-to-day lives, right? Less than men to some degree, but we all still have it. And really, for so many women, the way to break the glass ceiling is to assimilate what they've seen from men. And so if we don't have women who are in positions of power, who believe in the value of bringing up other women, if we don't have people of color in positions of power who believe in holding the door open for the next one, training up the next people, then it doesn't make sense to have them in positions of power. So I appreciate you saying that, because that's my stance about it. I don't just think that we need to have lots of training programs and get lots of women. Who are these women and what do they believe? That's my feeling. You just kind of broke open a thing for me, because I'm always like, yes, I get, they say the future is female. I'm like, okay, that's a whole other thing, because my daughter is non-binary. So if the future is female, where do they sit? But anyway.
I agree with you that it's systemic, and that there's also internalised misogyny that's happening because it is systemic. What I would say, though, is anecdotally, when I was a very young journalist in the early Cro-Magnon era, working in newsrooms, all of my bosses were men. I mean, I think I had one boss who was a woman in the first 20 years in the media industry. And if there were more women in editorial positions, I do believe that these stories about domestic violence and sexual assault would have been told much earlier. And if there were more people of colour in these positions, I do believe there would be more stories told about marginalised communities and our First Nations people. So I do genuinely think that diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of culture, diversity of gender, all of those things are still incredibly important.
I do too, by the way. Don't think I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we have to be more thoughtful about how we go about it. That's all.
Yeah. Got it.
Tarana, what your have said about the current American leadership. Have you ever thought of running for office?
No.
Why not?
No, that's not my ministry. I'm just too raunchy and too loud and I just can't follow rules that well. You know, there's probably a couple of scandals waiting to happen. I'd rather keep them to myself and do my work where people don't have to pay attention. No, I'm not. I don't. I want to support people who have that gene, who have that in them to do that. And other people who are truth tellers. I'm a truth teller, but I believe there are other truth tellers out there who can do a much better job than me. I curse too much.
Lovely. Everybody, please join me in thanking both the Sydney Prize winners, Tarana Burke, Tracey Spicer. And I have a gift for each of you, the gift of membership here to the Press Club. Tarana, I know that this is your first trip to Australia and you may not be back for a while, but it gives you visiting rights to the Press Club in Washington.
It does?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Tracey, thank you both very much.
That's very special.
I appreciate that.
It's very fancy.